Welcome, everybody. I'm Dr. Richard Smith, Executive Chairman of the Foundation for the Study of Cycles, and I am thrilled to be here today with a guest that I've been working to get on this show and in front of our Cycles audience for a long time, John Mauldin, a man who I'm sure needs a little introduction to this audience, but John has been helping millions of people make sense of our world, especially in the financial world, for decades now, over 30 years, author of over 6 books. And for me personally, also a student of cycles. And there's so much going on in our world right now around cycles, other authors writing about cycles. We've talked to Neil Howe, George Friedman is talking about cycles, Peter Turchin is talking about cycles, Ray Dalio is talking about cycles. And John has been working to make sense of it all. And he's working on a new book on this very topic. So John, welcome. Thank you for joining us today. We're thrilled to have you and can't wait to start talking about cycles.
Richard, thanks for having me. I think we'll have some fun. And it is something that I'm very involved with right now. I am, in fact, 80% of the book's written, maybe more. I'm, in fact, doing final edits and changes. And like any book, no book is ever finished. They're eventually abandoned in disgust. So, but I keep adding chapters and oh yes, I read something, I've got to put that in, and then it starts flowing. And because I think, well, going back, I started, reading Neil Howe early on in the aughts. They wrote the Fourth Turning, and through a series of circumstances, Neil and I became very close friends, and still are. And we would, look at the predictions, and then you get into the teens, and he's looking more prophetic. But I would still ask him, where are we going to see the war? Where does all this bad stuff happen? And his answer would be kind of, I'm paraphrasing very loosely, well, I don't know, but it will. And now we're not asking where the war will come. We're asking which one and how, and it's no longer inconceivable. It's no longer an economic crisis is no longer inconceivable. A social crisis is no longer inconceivable. That turning is really kind of in our faces happening. What about that time? George Friedman and I in the aughts became very good friends, and he was talking about it. Cycles, and then he did his book on, the storm before the calm, where he talked about geopolitical and cycles, but he sees an 80-year cycle and a 50-year cycle, and both of them culminate the latter part of this decade. Going back to Neil, he sees generational cycles. So he says there's one big long cycle, roughly 80 years.
Right.
So you have 4 generations. But I tease him. I says, basically what you're saying is every 80 years, we screw our kids up the same way that, our great grandparents did. And so you get this generational pattern that repeats.
Yes.
Now, on a sidebar, Neil will say, we're going to look back at 100 years from now, but that those cycles may be lengthening because we're living longer. We're no longer getting born and having kids by the time we're 20. Now it's 25 to 30, number one. And number two, just that whole generational pattern may be shifting. But that's one of the things that we don't know. But sometime...
It's interesting, though, how you got 80 years with Neil Howe and 80 years with George Friedman.
But they come from the same historical analysis. And you get the same thing when you're reading Dalio's books of the economic cycles, the business cycles. Turchin's not as year focused. He's more Turchin. I'm jumping ahead myself, but so Neil sees these 2 geopolitical cycles, these 2 50-year cycles, and 80-year cycles culminating into this decade. The Fourth Turning in Neil Howe is culminating at the end of this decade. Turchin just finished a book about 3 years ago called The End Times. And his thesis is that societies and cultures going back thousands of years produce too many elites, whether it's too many sons of barons that start competing with each other, too many tribal warlords that start competing with each other. Today, it's more elite now is in terms of, where's your focus of influence, your sphere of influence, your status in society. It's not necessarily income and wealth, but it can be. There are a lot of people that are elite that are not wealthy, but they have a lot of influence on us.
Yes.
And it's that overproduction of elite that begin to compete with each other for influence of power that always creates the crisis, because what he calls the immiserated, those who are not in that elite circle, get frustrated. And you get revolutions, you get pushback, or you get elites gathering groups around them to compete with other elites.
I love that thesis that really the conflict that we're in right now is an intra-elite conflict, right? It's a conflict between, too many elites, not enough elite seats, right?
It's the old game of musical chairs.
Right.
But for Friedman, he sees it in terms of specialists and generalists, and he sees it far broader. He for him, you go back and you see we fundamentally changed the concept of what government was in the American Revolutionary War, which had changed 80 years before in England when they had their own change. Then we changed around the Civil War. We changed the role of government and how we as citizens, what that compact looks like. That changed again in the 30s and 40s. And the latest change has become the role of the specialist, the person that runs things, because we became very comfortable after World War II with government doing things, government running our lives, because they'd done a good job with World War II. So we let that government power, and that had been building up under Roosevelt. Okay, but it really began to manifest itself in the late 40s and 50s.
I think also, John, it was the era of big science, right? With the atomic bomb. I mean, and that was something that nobody could have really anticipated, right? And it put this veneer of authority on science, and government became very interested in the scientists at that point, right? And now we have this kind of tyranny of the experts world.
That comes right to what Friedman was saying. We've gone from a role of specialist, and the next cycle is going to bring out the generalist. Because right now we're seeing pushback on specialists, on not just scientists, on bureaucracies that saying we have the right to control you. And people are going, well, I mean, I don't know what Elon Musk is doing to my Twitter feed, but I get more and more feeds of policemen looking like they're overstepping their bounds. I mean, there's just hardly any other way to look at it. But the other, I guess I shouldn't say that. I also get more and more people just being stupid around police. I mean, just say, please hit me, arrest me. I'm going to be stupid.
Give me my 5 minutes of pain.
This friction, but it's science has lost some of its glimmer after COVID. It's increasingly losing its glimmer with the awareness that a lot of the climate models are just that. They're models. They're not science. And when people tell us that science is settled, the science is settled. First of all, that means you don't understand science, because other than if you get an identity equation, when you develop something that's, like 2 + 2 = 4, that's an identity equation. When you develop something to that role, then it's settled. But it was Max Planck, I think it was, that said that physics advances one funeral at a time.
Beautiful.
And
I love that.
he was a very famous physicist in the 30s. And what he was talking about is people become enamored of theories, they become enamored of their ideas, and then they defend those. And other people are becoming comfortable with other ideas, but they don't want to push it because it's not the thing to do. Well, the guy dies, then okay, well, let's push this new theory. And while it's an exaggeration, it also had some truth to it, and that's why we still remember that quote. In the climate world, we get models, and nothing is. We think this is settled, and yet there are other models out there that say, well, it's not as settled as we think. Why don't we look at this? Well, no, we can't look at that because that doesn't agree with our model. And I have a skepticism about models in general, but that comes from my finance and economics background. I get, this may be heresy on this channel, but I get skeptical about people saying, well, this cycle, look, this repeats itself. Well, it's an N of 3 or an N of 5. When it repeated itself 50 times, let's look at it. But then they make these models that project and predict, and then 5 years later we forget about those models because it didn't work. It's very easy to create a model, and by the way, we need models. I'm all for creating models, but you need to recognize the limits that models have.
Isn't it about an issue of authority, right? That
there you go.
And response.
That comes right back to that point about elites.
Yes.
Okay. And that pushback where people are becoming uncomfortable being told this or that. You get pushback over elites today saying, well, misinformation doesn't fall under the First Amendment. It's not freedom of speech. You're not free to speak misinformation. Okay, well, whose misinformation? Who gets to determine that? That's a tricky issue. Actually, it's not a tricky issue. Everybody's perfectly willing to be the person that determines what truth is. And so I'm more turned 75 in a few weeks. I've learned that sometimes my 20s and 30s guys that was absolutely positive about how things go on, maybe I was just a little too positive. Things are a little bit more gray. Things change stuff. But you still get this the passion of youth saying this is the way life should be.
So that's the Turchin side of things, right? This idea of the conflict between the elites and the role of authority and how it's being wielded today, and how it connects with, say, Neil Howe's fourth turning,
right?
And George Friedman's cycles of the 80-year institutional cycle and the 50-year socioeconomic cycle, all kind of coming together at this very unique moment in time. And one of the things that, I read through all your letters on cycles, which were fantastic. If anybody wants cliff notes to Neil Howe, George Friedman, and Peter Turchin, you just Google
I'm doing a series right now on Martin Gurry's book, The Revolt of the Public, which I sadly didn't read till this year. I should have read it 3 or 4 years ago.
Which ties right into all of these. I think that's how you kind of tie the big picture together, if I'm not mistaken.
Gurry gives us the why all of this happens, and it actually comes from frustration. Some of it's wealth disparity, some of it's all relative, but it becomes a frustration of people being told this is the way you must think, this is the way you must act, and people push back against that. And it becomes what he talks about. It's culminating anger, and it just erupts at some point. And he's not predicting the way the other authors did. He just simply saying, look, this is what's happening, and we can see the public becoming frustrated. And to his world, Trump wasn't a social movement. It was a social, Trump was a wrench to throw in the system. People were upset and angry. Bernie Sanders had the same appeal, and they were able to tamp him down. We'll see how Trump does in this election. If Trump loses, it's because people are frustrated as well. But it shows how marginal. I mean, it's going to be close. I mean, unless one of the candidates does something different, it's going to be close, and we'll probably wake up Thursday morning and see how Pennsylvania did. I've already told myself I'm going to discipline myself not to stay up till 2 o'clock in the morning waiting for Pennsylvania results to come in on Tuesday, because they probably won't. So
yeah, Martin Gurry, very interesting. His book Revolt of the Public, right, which was self-published. I didn't realize that until recently, but it's made quite the rounds.
Yeah, it got picked up. I mean, Mark Andreessen made it his go-to book, said everybody's got to read this back when it first came in. I mean, there's a lot of big name people that are pushing book. The whole point here is that we have a crisis, and my contribution, if you will, to this. So we go through. Davio's got the whole business cycle. He's up to like a 40% chance of a civil war now. I don't know how you pull those numbers, but still, you have to respect his study of history and his analysis. He's very good at that. You may not agree with him, but you respect it. But he sees the wealth disparity and the wealth and income disparity as being part of the problem. As a sidebar,
yes,
the wealth disparity. Well, let me ask you a question.
Sure.
Let's go to 1970. You got the S&P 500 and you got homes. Fast forward to today. Which grew faster and by how much?
I'd guess the S&P 500 grew faster by 2x.
Closer to 20x.
20x. Wow.
Real estate remember, it got eaten up by inflation.
Yeah.
And it hasn't, now real estate's grown, but it hasn't grown. It only did like 2x over cash. 10-year bonds did better.
Yeah.
Gold did better. Now, that's artificial because we picked a price when gold was 35 in 1970. But still, the S&P far outperformed everything. So people who put their IRAs and pensions and stuck it into an index fund, because we didn't have many choices back then, and in the 80s and 90s, and then your kids inherited that grew up. And we had a very entrepreneurial society, which created wealth. So a lot of that wealth disparity is actually just a result of capitalism working, if you will. And yes, a lot of people weren't along for the ride. And we're going to have to address that, because even though and this will probably get me canceled everywhere, but even though the poor in our country are vastly well off than the poor in 90% of the countries, it's relative. And so somebody today looks at, they go from their side of the town to, if I was back in Dallas, you go from, the south side Oak Cliff, and then you go into Highland Park, North Dallas, or Frisco, or any of there's this monster difference. And people can see that. And it's frustrating, because we all want the same thing that everybody else wants. We want to be comfortable, because the lack of money creates discomfort. It creates ill ease in ourselves. I mean, when you're with the average person in this country, literally like 47% used to be, it's probably at 50 now, only has $400 in savings. They're one blown tire, one, a kid needing to go to the emergency room away from no cash. And I've got 8 kids, and believe me, I hope when they have a crisis in their family. And it creates this tension in your life, and that tension gets manifested in how you see the world because it doesn't feel unfair. And the fact that I can say, well, I literally grew up in the lower class. Dad was an alcoholic. I mean, there were times when mother's income, when she had to create stuff just to go out and figure out how to make money to survive. I mean, by the time I was 12, I was working. I bought all my clothes at school and everything from when I was 12 on.
Wow.
I mean, so I'm saying, wow, look where I started. I was poor, and but now people look at me. I'm living in Puerto Rico. I'm in a nice home, a beautiful wife,
Nice
great
suit.
kids, living on, just not that far from the beach. Life is good for this gringo.
Yeah.
And the fact that, 70 years ago, that was what I was living in, doesn't factor with me. I mean, I get emails all the time that I'm this rich elitist, and somehow I grew up with this silver spoon.
Right.
I grew up, I got lucky when I took an SAT, and I got a scholarship, and but that doesn't factor into how people feel. And it's that frustration that's going to create the cycle. I think the pin, if you will, what's going to pop it? Because none of this is going to get solved outside of a crisis. We're going to be 50-50 up until the moment we enter the real crisis. I think the crisis is going to be the debt. Probably first in Europe, we'll learn a little bit from them. China's beginning to have their own debt issues. Their debt to GDP is an issue. China is growing old before it grows rich. Japan at least grew rich before they grew old. When we get to the place, we're at 35 trillion now. When I was talking about these numbers and predicting where the debt would be 10, 15 years ago, every time I predicted 3-4 years later, I'm always, people would say, John, that's so pessimistic. And every time I do it, 3-4 years later, I'm always wrong because it's worse. So, I think by the 31, 32, we're at $60 trillion. I mean, can we
give a more number?
And if we're at $60 trillion, long-term bonds are going to be 4, 5, 6. I mean, how much can the market absorb? Well, at that point, literally interest on the debt is consuming 30, 40% of our taxes. By 2032, under the current structure that we have for Social Security, literally the law would mandate a 27% in all Social Security income. Is that going to happen? No. But I'll be, in 2032, I'll be 83. Right now, I get $52,000 or $53,000 a year in Social Security checks. I'm shocked. COVID, I'm up like 20% on my Social Security checks since COVID because it just grows with inflation. So it's a real number that I see at the bottom. Now I have to pay taxes on it, and I'd have been much better off if we would put it in the S&P 500 back in. If they had started putting my Social Security income into the S&P 500 when I was 70s, I would be worth, I don't know, 10 million, 15 million of just in that account. I could probably cope with that.
Oh, man.
In fact, I could even afford to live in Puerto Rico on that. We can all live in Puerto Rico. But are they going to let me get Social Security? Now I'm 83. They're to say, well, you're 83. We can't take it away, but we'll take it away from other people. They'll have to means test it. I mean, when you're that far over your skis, everything goes under the table. They're going to have to change the retirement. They're going to have to change how we're doing Medicare. We're going to have to change how we do medical procedures. The good news is that I think by the mid-30s, medical costs are going to go down, not up, because we'll be living longer and we'll be living healthier, better living through chemistry. But when we said better living through chemistries in the 60s and 70s, we meant something entirely different back then. Today we'll actually be extending life, extending health spans. In the late 20s and 30s, phenomenal stuff happening. Even though I'm talking about a crisis cycle, I'm an optimist because I think cool stuff is happening. But
yeah,
we're going to have this crisis, and it can't be solved just by raising taxes. The rich don't make enough. They literally, you could double the taxes on the rich. So you're taking almost 80-90% of their income, and it only gets us about half the way there. You've taken all their income of the top 10%, and it only gets us half the way there. Now, you collapsed the society when you did that, so there's nothing left. And you can't do it all with cuts, because now you've got we put people on welfare, on benefits, on Social Security, on Medicare, and you can't jerk that from them because their life comes to an end. So we're going to have to restructure things. There's, probably have to have a value-added tax. I think that's the only way that you get the capital. Well, that's going to hit the middle class or the lower class. Yes, it will. But do you want to get rid of Medicare and Social Security? Well, we're going to have to raise tax on the rich. Yes. We're going to have to cut a lot of spending out. A lot of spending. We're going to have to rethink how we do military. We're going to have to think the world's going to have to rethink their whole role.
Sounds like the end of a cycle.
It's the end of a cycle, and those types of really contentious, difficult decisions.
Yeah.
Because if I sit down in a random group of people and say, well, we're going to cut Medicare, we're going to cut Social Security, we're going to extend retirement age,
tax you more.
We're going to tax you more. We're going to reduce government services.
All at a time when everybody's at each other's throats already.
Evolve things back to the local society and have less of a federal presence because we just can't afford it.
Right.
That's not going to go over well in that crowd, because everybody's going to be angry at something you're suggesting.
Right.
But when they're at the edge of the cliff and they're looking over, and it's an abyss and it's a long way down, and you're either going to jump off, we're all going to die, or we can sit and figure out, well, maybe we can compromise so that we don't all die. It takes that level of, or you get a World War II. Where you get a civil war, where, you really restructure it that way, which is not a very good option. I'm against bullets being in the air. So
one of the things I thought
it will take that crisis, and that's what these writers and their cycles are talking about. I think that is that pin that will find that bubble, that because none of them say this is what the crisis will be. They're all saying that history tells us there will be a crisis. Michael Gurry is saying here is why there's going to be a crisis, because it's the revolt of the public. Everybody's fed up. I'm saying that I think the debt will be the pin that forces us to because when you restructure the role of society, the role of the relationship between the government and the people, because that's what we're talking about. We're talking about a radical restructure.
Mm-hmm.
And because that's going to force a restructuring of society. That's going to force a restructuring of what we think of as family. I mean, it's so difficult.
Yeah.
It is hard for us to imagine. Now, every one of these circles talks about the period after you have the resolution, and you get in the 50s. You get Leave It to Beaver, Ozzie and Nelson. You get the 50s. You had, even though we had financial crisis in the 70s, you had this roaring expansion. And people don't realize in the 70s, I'm talking about 1870s, we had we had deflation. So you get people talking, we're not going to crucify ourselves on a cross of gold. You get the whole Mauldin thing. But it was massively deflationary because they built the canals, the railroads, and they were able to move goods and services from the West, foods, to take manufacturing products from the East. And it was this, and because the McCormick Reaper came along, all of these things made us massively more productive. The prices of stuff dropped. You had to get bigger. Then when we'd gone from the first industrial revolution to the second, and you get this massive boom in wealth. The same thing after the Revolutionary War. We had a period where it was fumbling. Then we created the Constitution.
Sure.
And that was a period of boom and prosperity and growth. It was a very optimistic period. And so we're going to see that again, but it's hard for us to imagine today. How can that possibly be? And yet, Gen Y, the crew, what history tells us is that you do see this change. I'm hoping that the biotech is good enough that I get to live through part of that.
I'm going to ask you about biotech and artificial intelligence. And do you think that these new technologies have anything to do with, the railroads of today?
Yes, the biotech will be part of the railroad. I mean, there's a therapy that I've gone through recently called therapeutic plasma exchange. Basically, think of it as an oil change for the body. You're a little young. You're not even 50 yet, right, Richard?
I'm actually closer to 60, John.
Okay, well then you're a target. What happens is when you turn late 40s and 50s, your body starts accumulating junk cells, old proteins that's basically senescent, and it's sending signals, and it creates problems in your body. Well, we take your blood, run it through a filter. We throw the plasma away. That's what's carrying all the junk. We put all the rest of it back, and you go through this repeatedly till you've basically replaced your blood. And it really has a significant. It's health span. It's some lifespan. It's really good for early stage Alzheimer's and dementia. I mean, there's a lot of research on this. There are two companies now. I'm following one closely, and now we've seen another one out of one is a Florida company, but it's based in the research that's being done out of Johns Hopkins. There's another one coming out of Texas that have a drug that is increasing telomere length. I mean, honest to God, old-fashioned, just boosting telomere length. Now, that's not the fountain of youth. That's not going to turn me back to 25 or 30. But it's going to make me live long enough to where we can do that. That's the goal now. And so Ray Kurzweil's law, you have to live long enough to live forever. And so you really do have to take care of yourself, because you are in an age, Richard, where you are going to be healthier and live longer. I mean, you really have the prospects of being 150 years old and being healthy at 150. And that's something that we can't even conceive of right now. It sounds fantasy, like this nut job in a blue jacket in Puerto Rico is talking about. But I mean, there's a reason that Bezos is putting money into it, that Google, I mean, there's literally billions being thrown at this. Now, I think there's some other paths that they should be taking, but they're all kind of moving in the same direction. Literally reprogramming our bodies to generate newer stem cells. That's one of the things that happens over time. We don't do that enough. So
that sounds like something that will require restructuring society if we start living to our.
I mean, it's one of the things. Once some of these drugs, we get to some of the early stage stuff will be available by the late 20s, and we're going to have people living longer. I mean, visibly going, oh my God, we're living longer. And people are going to say, well, maybe we should. It'll be easier to move the retirement age at that point. AI is I don't think we understand how much that's going to change things yet. We're still it's still the 1850s in railroads. We're just beginning to build the infrastructure to build out.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, I know that we were talking, the first time I read about artificial intelligence was in the mid 80s, and the promise that we were going to get, and I'm still waiting for my flying car that's driven by AI. But we're getting there now.
I mean, Microsoft just had Constellation start up a nuclear reactor that they're going to buy all the power from.
Absolutely. I mean, it's the head of Oracle,
Larry Ellison.
Larry Ellison was at a conference here like 3 weeks ago. I saw bits and pieces of it, and he's saying it used to be there was some movie he was referencing. The buy-in to get into a game was like 1,000 or 5 or 10. To get it is the buy-in for AI is 100 million.
Yeah,
that's your buy-in. That's table stakes. That just gets you at the table. Doesn't mean you're going to win. That's just what you're going to put in. And he says, and if you win, it's going to cost you more.
Right.
And we're going to have to build nuclear reactors. We're literally talking building nuclear reactors to power this stuff. Bitcoin takes, I heard, I don't know, Bill Maher is my source, but he's talking like 8% of power the country is going to, in the world is going to Bitcoin mining. Talk about a non-productive use of power. I mean, if you're a Bitcoin fan, that sounds like a great thing, but a lot of power. We'll let the market sort that out. But AI itself is not the real power drag as much as the cloud is. The cloud's like 3 or 4 times bigger because we have to save all our CAD videos.
I saw an interesting interview with one of the guys who's one of the leaders in AI saying, the data that we have right now, we don't only have not enough energy, but we don't have enough data, right? And ultimately, the real data that we have to get is basically, in our brains. We have to tap into our brains and get all the data that is being generated by our brains in order to build the ultimate AI model. Now, that all sounds a little invasive and far-fetched to me, but that is the direction it's going.
That's where we're going. And Kurzweil, not 20 years ago, well, damn near 20 years ago now, was talking about his date, for real sentient artificial intelligence was in the mid 40s. And we're still probably there. We're going to see we see some pretty cool stuff now that can pass a Turing test, but it's still not self-aware. There's a difference between being able to pass a to fool a human being. I mean,
Right.
the videos that you see with people with artificial intelligence, yeah, if you didn't just know they were spoofing you, it looks pretty real. But
Yeah.
that's a spoof. It's not self-aware. Somebody's driving that.
Yeah.
But when you get to a self-aware computer, that's what they call the singularity, and it was coined by a science fiction writer that just recently passed away, Hall of Famer. I'll think of his name. He was a mathematician at UCSD, and he says that after we have self-aware computers that are truly able to program themselves and think, are self-aware, not just artificially aware. We don't know what will happen after that. That's the singularity. It's in the same way that when you're moving toward a black hole and you come to the threshold of the black hole, all mathematics changes. Everything in physics changes, and we have some speculation about what happens on the other side of that black hole, but we don't know.
Sure.
Because everything changes. And everything, once you get self-aware computers, truly self-aware, everything changes. But we're not sure what history will look like 100 years from now. But I mean, now we've gotten way off of cycles, and we're now in
Yeah,
a
I
cycle.
mean, well, I don't think we're that far off actually, because if we tie this back to, what all these thinkers are seeing, right? How Dalio, Turchin,
You know,
and Friedman, right? Everybody's talking about something crescendoing. You're talking about the debt crescendoing right now. I
and
love
yeah,
Turchin's work, the wealth disparity, right? And our mutual friend Ben Hunt talks about this a lot. The difference.
I was just talking with Ben on the call just before. In fact, I hung up to take this call because
Did you really? Oh, well, Ben has been an amazing resource for me, and I think he's one of the great chroniclers of our time. Really, he's so good at articulating what's wrong and kind of making that accessible to many more people. So really grateful to him for that. But and he talks about the difference between wealth and GDP, right? And Peter Turchin is talking about the increase in wealth versus the increase in wages. Another person who I think we both appreciate and admire, I'm sure you know him, the other George, right? Not George Friedman, but George, the telecom, George Gilder, right?
Okay.
He talks about
they were really close friends.
Yes, I mean George Gilder. My background's in information theory, so I have a PhD in information theory and complexity science. I actually studied at Santa Fe Institute for a little while with Peter Turchin. Yes, I did, and artificial life.
For those who are not aware, Santa Fe Institute does some of the most fascinating work on complexity theory of any place in the world.
I was there in 1998, and that's basically what I got my PhD in.
Well, that's we have another friend that looks at complexity theory, Bill White, who was the chief economist for the Bank of International Settlements for a decade. Mm-hmm. And he sees the world in terms of complexity theory, which is why he says that all of the central banks of the world trying to model things is impotent, because it's so far more complex than they can put in a two-dimensional model.
Absolutely. And that goes back to the whole model question about science in general. I personally like Oliver Wendell Holmes' statements that, I wouldn't give a fig for simplicity, but I'd give my right arm for simplicity on the other side of complexity. Right. So when you kind of go through all that complexity and you arrive at that simplicity, right, that's a good place to be. So just kind of bringing it back to the cycles, right? We have this kind of inconceivable debt. We have really hard decisions to make. We don't trust each other right now. As a system scientist, from a systems perspective, we have this system that kind of thrives on division and two-party system, first past the post, right? So
Right.
we're in a really tough spot that there's so much debt, there's so much disparity, there's so much to sort out, and we're not doing a very good job of talking to each other.
No, and
That kind of sums it up.
we're to the point now where we think the other side is the enemy. I mean, and it's
And that's by design, right? I mean, in some way, it's by design. It's a flaw in our system. I don't know if it's a flaw or not. But
it's become a function of media. And one of the resolutions that will happen over time is that media, in terms of mainstream, will become less important. I mean, the numbers are already down on mainstream media relative to everything else. Their audiences are going because, I mean, you get the publisher, the editor of Washington Post coming into a staff and saying, "You guys are losing us our audience. You don't understand your audience because you're not writing. You're trying to tell them what to believe rather than telling them the news." I mean, he just chew them out. That's what I read reported.
right.
I distilled it, but that's it's people are looking for alternatives, and social media has fed into this because it's helped us to move into tribes. And
Guri's idea too, right? Of the revolt of the public.
right. I mean, so we moved into tribes, and not unlike tribes in the Middle Ages, or we don't like them. They're different. That even though we may have been the same genetic stock, they're that tribe and we're not. We're better or whatever.
Yeah.
It's
How do we look at this crisis that's coming to us, John? I mean, you've said we got a Category 5 hurricane coming our way. We can't, just hide out from it, right? How do we do this as individual human beings? Anybody listening to this show, yes, we have to protect ourselves, but it seems like this is inevitable. Like we have to face it.
the first thing we have to do is to take the rational optimist approach and recognize that we will get through it and there will be another side.
Mm-hmm.
It's going to be messy. It could be kinetic. So let's start with first principles. If we're going to get through it, then what's it going to look like possibly? And how can I manage my portfolio, my assets, my family to do everything we can? And in my view, and it's a very narrow view, I think our goal is to get as much buying power as we can have today to the other side.
Right, because there are looking at
because we don't know what assets are going to look like on the other side. I mean,
sure,
I can paint you a picture of deflation. I can give you an highly inflationary atmosphere. I mean, because we don't know who's going to be running the system when the crisis happens, and we don't know what's. I mean, it's not going to change overnight. It's going to take some time because something this big always takes time. The American Revolution, the Civil War, World War II, the whole Roosevelt era, that took time. So your goal is to get through, and there will be there will be another side. The second thing is if it becomes messy, as in terms of kinetic, as in terms of really frustrating, you have to decide where you want to be on that. At 75, I'll be 80 by that time. I probably don't want to be on the front lines. I mean, I don't even own a gun, so but that's kind of a.
And you're from Texas.
That means I'm not a very good Texan, I guess.
I guess
not. But you want to make sure your family's safe. Where are we going to be safe? Where do you want to live? And even though we said we've broken into tribes, You need to find your tribe. Ben Hunt says finding your pack.
Sure.
You need to find, who are we going to go through this with? Who can I trust? Who's got my back, and how do I have their back? And it's more than family, and it's more than a geographic region. It's how do we work together in now what's truly more and more of a global society. I mean, I was talking with another online thing we were doing today, talking about the difference between China and India and the rest of Asia. And China, and the Chinese market is up like, I don't know, 10x over China. I mean, sorry, the Indian market is up like 10x over the last 20 years. It's monster. And even though 20 years ago we all said China's going to be the bright star. It goes back to George Friedman thing. You start at any 20-year period, start at 1900, and then you just keep moving forward for 20 years. And whatever we thought at the beginning, whatever we thought in 1900, we couldn't imagine that Europe would have been devastated and Germany absolutely collapsed. So you get to 1920, well, Germany will never come back. Well, 20 years later, they were threatening Europe and did. And then, I don't know, we get to 1960 and Russia's going to be the big thing. By the 80s, they were still there, but they were gone 10 years later. In time, the things that we push and look at, it changes. If you can think of 20 years as a blink of an eye, but it changes pretty fast. And we don't expect these things. So here in 2024, when you get to 2044, we're going to look back and we're going, what we're close to that singularity. We're now, if you are young enough, because you've got that 15-year advantage on me, there's a fraction of 1% chance that I've got good genetics that I might be able to live a little bit longer, and hopefully live enough till they figure out how to begin to really turn us back young again. You're young enough. If you take care of yourself and healthy, you will. Well, that'll be happening at 44. We'll all be in the middle of that, and we'll be looking back and going, wow, we were all worried about this crisis coming up and how it was going to change our lives. But, we survived. Some of us did. And, but in 44, those who survived will be sad for those, but they'll be surviving. You want to try to be part of that. But it will look amazingly different. The world will look, and we have no idea today. We can speculate on all sorts of things, but it's just speculation. But in 44, we'll look back. We can say biotech is going to improve. Artificial intelligence is going to improve. Technology is going to improve. We'll have a colony on the moon. There's lots of things that we're going to look back and go, well, of course. But because today we pick up our phone, our iPhone, and sort of grab it and just, well, of course, this is what a phone should look like. Well, it didn't look like that in 2004, and it certainly didn't look like that in 1984.
No. I did use a rotary dial phone. In my life.
Well, literally, we had, when I was growing up, we only had, a phone number was 5 numbers, and it was a shared line. So there were 8 of us on the line. I forget what it was called, but so if you picked up the phone, you had to say if anybody else is on it, and they connected you with an operator. I was in Fort Texas and West Texas. That's just, we were lucky to have phones and let alone a TV, which hopefully didn't work. And if it did work, it was because I went to the store and bought a tube because I had to figure out how to, I was like 11, 12 years old, and I had to figure out how to repair the TV. if I wanted the TV to work. But I mean, and we move fast forward, and you go, well, yeah, why? And the concept of actually having a tube tester when you're,
Right.
10 years old, where you take all the tubes out of because the TV doesn't work, where you have to take all the tubes out. And you'd have this box with all the different type of plugs for the tubes, and you'd put it in there, work a button to see if the tube worked. And if that tube didn't work, then you'd go to the local store. There was a guy that had this whole display of tubes, and you'd take your tube and you'd change it because we were too poor to call the TV repairman. I mean, it's just,
Yeah.
and
You don't know what
we
piece
look at
is
that,
gonna hold.
and we thought that was cool technology. You could actually watch TV and get your news and programs. What a fascinating thing. If and doing that in 1960 actually. I was still in West Texas. World had completely changed by 1980 and by 2000. It changes. And it's hard. We as human beings, we project where we are today into the future, and we see that growth is linear.
Right.
And growth since the late 1700s has gone exponential on us. Change has gone exponential. Somebody that was born in 1700 didn't see that. If somebody was born in 1600, there wasn't that much change between 1600 and 1700. But by the time he got to 1800, there were some changes. From 1800 to 1900, the world would be unrecognizable. From 1900 to 2000,
Yeah.
I mean, my dad was born in 1910 and literally hitched up the wagon in Castleberry, Texas, to drive 6 miles to downtown Fort Worth because they were out in the country. Today, it's a little bitty suburb of Fort Worth. And I mean, by the time he was 57 years old, we put a man on the moon.
Right.
These
True.
And so what we're doing now, and people saying, you're talking about cycles. Guys, we're talking about things will change, and they're going to change, and they will be better. It will be bumpy. All of those periods had wars, they had crises, they had depressions, they had recessions, they had market collapses, housing collapses. I mean, all of this stuff happened even as the world improved. And so
I think that's right, John.
you have to make sure that you're not in front of the oncoming train and you're taking advantage. You're going with that acceleration and get in front of that. Don't get in and don't get trapped into linear thinking because it's a genetic default in humans.
Right.
I mean, but that's literally the world we grew up in.
You're right.
From 100,000 AD, living on the savannah.
Kind of what we're programmed for.
We were programmed to be linear thinkers.
Sure.
And it is just, you have to actually force yourself to say, this world is going to improve on an exponential curve. And
I think that's one of the things that cycles can do for us is to help us understand that there is hope on the other side. And that, I mean, if we could appreciate that, human beings, I liked the way you put it at the beginning, George Friedman, of, so every 80 years we screw our children up so bad.
Yeah.
We got to start all over again. And, it's true as a parent, I'm sure you kind of want to spoil your kids, you don't want them to have a hard time.
My kids did not grow up doing the things that I had to do.
Right.
So we tried to make both of them work, but some of the younger kids, getting them to work was now it's like, Dad, you should have pushed me more because they're the youngest one that was in my house is 30. My wife's got a younger one that's 25, but they've got kids now.
Right.
And I mean, so it's
they'll all
I turned 75 in 10 days, and my kids and grandkids are all coming in. 8 kids and their significant others, and 9 grandkids. So But it's that
Yeah.
generational change.
Yeah, I like that, John. I'd be remiss if I didn't ask you one more question before we
You're gonna
wrap
have
up.
two or three.
Okay. Well, one is, do you what's your opinion of what assets are going to be valuable on the other side of this crisis?
I'll tell you what I'm doing personally.
Okay.
I've always my default choice has been alternative investments, hedge funds, commodity funds, private credit. That was the world that I've helped clients with, and I like business startups. It's just what I grew in. I'm shifting my portfolio this year, next year, to be look more like dividend growth, high and growing dividends. One of the things that will be here in the mid 2030s will be Exxon Mobil. Morgan Stanley is likely going to be here. I mean, these are big companies that are paying dividends, and they've grown their dividend every year for 20, 30, 40 years. And that compounding effect creates value. And they're typically not that, they don't have the high valuations of the tech world.
Sure.
Do I think, that a lot of those big tech names will be here in 10, 15 years? Yeah, but I don't know what their valuation is going to be, but I want to get that 3-4% income on dividends. And then the other half, I want it to be in alternatives that are not that don't have the exposure to markets as much. I work with I basically refer clients to another investment advisor that's a large investment advisor that offers all the service, and they're very, very good at finding dividends and finding alternatives, and then creating portfolios individually for people. Because our goal, and I believe they have the ability to make a change if we get into the late 20s and we like, oh my God, we got to change. I think they have the philosophical ability to do that. My wife is a little younger than I am, and if something, the plane falls out of the sky, I want somebody to make sure that she gets to the other side, and my kids and their get to the other side. So that's what I'm doing. I'm launching a new business based around the therapy we were talking about earlier. So I'm still optimistic. I think there's new businesses, I'm like Buffett. You don't bet against America.
You're not sticking your head in the sand and burying the gold in the backyard.
No. My gold I bought in the early aughts, very cheap.
Yeah.
And it's sitting in a vault. And percentage-wise in my portfolio, it's it's up like 8-9x, so it's still there. My greatest dream is that my gold goes to zero.
Right.
Because that means everything else worked. I'm afraid that won't be the case.
It's not heading in that direction right now.
It doesn't work that way right now. I don't think that's the way it works.
No. And then, cycle-wise, it's so interesting to me with all of these writers writing about cycles, right? Bestsellers, right? Yet Edward Dewey, the founder of the Foundation for the Study of Cycles, founded it in 1941, right? And yet nobody talks about Dewey. Nobody talks about the work that he did along with the head of the Smithsonian, the guy from Yale University who was in geology. I forget his name at the moment. Raymond Wheeler on the weather and all of the work that he did with climate and its influence on culture, et cetera. So there was so much going on, especially in the 40s, 50s, 60s. And yet
we're beneficiaries of it. We just assume.
Yeah. Well, I think it's partly that they were looking for some kind of external cause, that was driving the cycles. And one of the things also I appreciate in Neil Howe's book that he says about cycles, and I'm interested in your thoughts on this too, is, America is the nation that sort of is the most skeptical about cycles. And yet we're also the nation that seems the most subject to cycles, right? So, how do you think we should understand cycles and use cycles, as a culture, as a society, and incorporate them into our understanding?
It's a very good question. And the problem is, Richard, that not a lot of people are going to buy into it. They want to think there's something, they want to have some other force out there or something that somebody else can control or not controlling them. I don't know how we can use it to use it as a governing principle. I think we have to take it as to allow it to influence our personal decisions, and just say we're going to kind of move our own thinking, our own way we live, the way we position ourselves with the light of that cycle. Not predicting things, because we can't predict the future. And we don't know specifically what's going to happen, but we can say we can at least be prepared for a crisis with the optimistic view that we're going to get through. And as things progress, as things progress, the way to get through hopefully will become more clear. So that's one of the reasons you find your tribe, is that you can talk with people about what are the ways we get through.
And that is important, to talk to people.
Right.
Real people, not just ChatGPT.
Yeah.
Good. Well, tell us a little bit about your book that's coming out and when it's coming out, and what we can look forward
probably be out end of the first quarter. We call the Great Restart. I'm cranking on it. I want it finished. It's this 800-pound gorilla on my shoulder. It's kind of like the last big short-term project, and I call it short-term. I've been working on it for a year, but it's the last short-term project that I've got before I can focus. I mean, I didn't really take a vacation this summer. I'm seeing Italy for a month next year, or Europe, or wherever. So
you're going to tie all these threads together,
all these cycles together, and then you'll have the promotion for the book. But I'm hoping it'll be out in the first quarter, maybe earlier than that.
Is it the Great Restart or the Great Reset?
It'll be the Great Restart. We can't call it the Great Restart because I'm not going to. When people tap that in, they're going to get the first 5 pages of search engines. Will be the World Economic Forum. So
right. And what's the best place for people to connect with your work today?
The best site is at Mauldin Economics.
Okay.
MauldinEconomics.com. Click on Thoughts from the Frontline. It's a free letter. Give me your email address, and then you're one of my 1 million closest friends. Every Saturday morning, we show up in your inbox. It's relatively short. It's 3,000 words. You can read it in 10 or 15 minutes, and it's kind of what my thinking for that week is. What's on the top of my mind.
All right. Well, I recommend it to everyone. And John, thank you for your decades of service to help us understand what's happening in the world. You're one of those guys that I think the public, we feel like we get a little glimpse into what's going on in the rooms that we don't usually get to go into. And we really appreciate it. So thank you. And we look forward to your book coming out. And thanks for taking the time to talk about cycles.
Not a problem. Thank you very, very much.